everybody, and welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about a series of videos that I've been thinking of recording for quite some time, and that is to take a look at old books that I used to love and reread them and see how I feel about them today. So kind of putting on my nostalgia goggles and looking back at things that were a 5-star read for me at the time during which I read them, and reflecting on how I feel about them today and whether or not those feelings are influenced heavily by my own nostalgia. I have always been a big rereader. It's something that I did all the time when I was, a preteen, teenager, even as a really young kid. But in my adult reading life, I have tried to move away from it. And this is where I started creating these intentional, books to read every year. And I started recording the names of the books that I read on a yearly basis. And I would kind of categorize them into recent reads or new reads and then rereads. And so I can go back. I have recorded for the last 15 years the books that I read, when I read them, if they were new or a reread. And I could go back and look at those pages and see when I read what. And it is interesting to look back now that I have such a relatively large pocket of data. I can go back and notice that years that were particularly stressful, whether that was like applying for medical school or a really intense year in my life, I tend to have higher numbers of rereads. And that's because these reads are comforting. You know what's going to happen. They're characters that you know and you love. And so it brings you that kind of peaceful sense to reread them. What I wanted to do for this video series was take some books that at the time I read them were favorites. So, I don't know if I conceptualized it this way back then, but 5-star reads at the period during which they were read. So I took a selection of 10 different books that I read. Most of them, I think the most recent read is still probably 15 years ago. So things that I have read 15 plus years ago, and I want to reread them this year, kind of interspersed among the newer, fantasy picks that I have for the year, and see how they measure up. I had been thinking about doing this, and then one thing that really kind of solidified it for me is when Mike over at Mike's Book Reviews, who is one of the first people that I started following on BookTube and a person whose channel I really admire, he did a read for his Stephen King series of The Talisman. And The Talisman, I have said for so long, is my favorite standalone Stephen King novel. And I say that, but I actually haven't read it since I was about 12 years old. So I am a big fan of The Dark Tower, and kind of as a precursor to The Dark Tower, my dad gave me The Talisman. So I read The Talisman. It was the first Stephen King book that I had ever read. And then from there, I went into The Dark Tower and then discovered others of King's works and kind of went on reading from there. But The Talisman has always held a really special place in my heart because it was the first Stephen King book that I ever read. And so when Mike did his review and he pointed out a lot of the things that maybe he didn't like as much and the reasons that he had for not liking them, I started to wonder, man, if I read this now, would I still like it? And it's a tricky thing to think about and to want to do, because what if on rereading I actually don't end up liking it as much? But that's that is a risk that you take when you're going to do a reread like this. But I am really curious, and so that is actually, I have it here in my little pile, that is the first book that I'm going to be rereading and the first one that I want to go back and take a look at. I have a really new ugly edition that I bought. My dad had a really old cool edition that I read, and I bought this one, I guess, just to kind of fill out my shelves. But I'm really looking forward to rereading this one. I read it, like I said, I read it for the first time when I was 12. This spine is crinkled, I now notice when I pick it up. So I'm guessing I have probably reread it once, but even then that would have been a really, really long time ago, still when I was in my teens. So I'm not sure how I'm going to feel about it, but I'm optimistic that I will still like it. Nostalgia tends to hold a lot of sway over me, so I would be surprised if I came out of this not enjoying it, but I think it will be interesting to go back and reread it as someone who has finished the Dark Tower series and someone who has a lot more experience with Stephen King's novels and a lot more experience in, a lot more experience reading in general, a lot more life experience. So it will be interesting to go back and take a look at this one for sure. The second book that I picked off my shelves, and the second book that came to mind when I was doing this, is the Shannara Trilogy by Terry Brooks. So I picked the second book, The Elfstones of Shannara, because I remember the plot of The Lord of the Rings, so that means I remember the plot of The Sword of Shannara, which sounds a little harsh, but they do share a startling number of similarities. I remember when I read the original trilogy, The Elfstones was I think it was my favorite. I don't know. Maybe the Wish Song was. But I remember enjoying Elfstones and Wish Song a lot more than I enjoyed The Sword of Shannara itself because of the heavy Tolkien influences, we'll say. But Terry Brooks, the Shannara series is Terry Brooks's magnum opus, I guess. It's his huge, expanding world of fantasy, and the original trilogy follows kind of a band of friends who are fighting against the powers of evil, fulfilling various quests. And so I would like to pick this one up because the actual world of Shannara allegedly came to a close this year. My dad was steadfast. He stayed true to Terry Brooks through to the very end, and he has now finished the entire series. I don't think that will ever happen with me. I did find that some of the themes and the stories became repetitive the longer I kept reading, and I lost my interest. But at the time when I read these books, particularly books 2 and 3 in this series, they were definitely 5-star reads for me. They were some of the books that introduced me to fantasy, and I do have, they do hold a special place for me for that reason. So I wouldn't mind going back and rereading particularly Elfstones and Wish Song just to see, how does it measure up? How do I feel about it today? And if I still feel like it's worthwhile, then, probably reviewing those and giving recommendations to people who may not have ever picked these up. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of the third book that I would like to reread. I read my dad's copies and I have tried to get them, but they're hard to get, and we don't have great used bookstores. We don't have any used bookstores in the town that I live in, but even in the capital city of the province that I live in, doesn't have great used bookstores, so it's been difficult to get my hands on a copy. But that would be The Crystal Cave by Mary Stewart. Mary Stewart's Crystal Cave is part of her Arthurian saga, which is her own retelling of the myth of Arthur and Merlin. And it takes like a slightly more historical bend. It talks about, the people who populate the story as if they were real people, kind of basing them on their real world counterparts. And so it definitely has elements of magic from what I remember, and kind of, straddles the line between, I guess, fantasy and magical realism. But I just remember I went through a really intense King Arthur phase early in my fantasy loving years, and this was absolutely my favorite of all of the books that I read, and I read a lot of them. So this series was my favorite of all of the King Arthur retellings I had ever read, and I would love to go back and reread it, particularly because there's a couple of new King Arthur retellings that I am going to pick up this year, and so I would like to go back and reread my old favorite and see how it measures up to those others that I'm planning to pick up. Next is a couple of, I guess, controversial books, controversial in the fantasy community and controversial definitely on BookTube. The first of those is Wizard's First Rule by Terry Goodkind. So I read Wizard's First Rule. I had a friend in school who owned most of the series because they still hadn't all been released at the time when I started reading them. But it was early, I think it was probably late in junior high when I started reading these. I was 13, around 13 when I started reading these books. And, at the time, I really liked them. I particularly liked the first one, and there was another, for anyone who has read this series, the other one that I liked is the one where Richard carves a statue. I don't remember which one that is, but if you do, then you can let me know. But I really liked that one, and I really liked Wizard's First Rule. I brought it, my husband and I went backpacking in Europe in, I think, 2011 maybe, and I brought it along at that point for him to read, and he also read it really quickly, like in, you know, a number of hours to a day. He finished it, and he also really enjoyed it. I know this book takes a lot of flack, and even as a kid, I was basically a kid when I read these books, but even back then, there was a noticeable change in tone. The ideology of the author shone through a lot more clearly the further you went along in the series. And so for that reason, my enjoyment did diminish as I continued along, but I remember really liking this one. You know, and maybe, I don't know, maybe that makes me a bad fantasy fan. Maybe it means I have poor taste. I don't know. But I think a lot of people do like this book. And I would like to go back and read it and see, like, is it as bad as everybody says it is? Is it really? Or is it just that, you know, overall, we don't tend to mesh with the ideology that comes up in these books. It is definitely not the way that I think or the way that I look at the world. And, you know, was there too much authorial insert and that's what kind of soured the series for everyone? Or does this really just suck? I don't know. I liked it at the time that I read it, and I would like to reread it and see how I feel about that now. And the next book is also one that's not really controversial on BookTube, but takes a lot of flack on BookTube. And this is one of the more recent books on the list. So that is Aragon by Christopher Paolini, who just had a new book come out last year, I believe. And so I've been thinking a little bit on Aragon lately, just as Christopher Paolini's name was coming back up and people seem to be talking about him more. And I noticed that Aragon, or the inheritance cycle, also tends to take a lot of flack, like I said, on BookTube. And, you know, these books are tropey. They follow Aragon and his dragon, Saphira, as they, you know, partake in adventures across the mythical land that Christopher Paolini created. There's a lot of heavy Star Wars influence, but I really like Star Wars. You know, it's heavily influenced by Tolkien, by classic fantasy, but I also really like those things. And I don't mind people paying homage to the writers that influenced them. And also, you know, the fact that he was a teenager when he read these books, I think, at least in my opinion, means that we can cut him a little slack in terms of the content. But overall, I feel like my memories of reading these books are ones of enjoyment. These were one of the few series of books that I actually purchased as a teenager. We didn't have a lot of funds or a lot of access to the bookstore, so we didn't buy a lot of new books. But I remember that this, obviously along with like Harry Potter and you know, really big series like that, these were one of the series of books that we made a point to go out and buy. And I remember really enjoying them. I don't remember having a particular favorite of the four. I just remember I like dragons. I like sword and sorcery, so I had a good time. It will be interesting to go back and read it, especially now that the young adult fantasy market has kind of expanded so much and flourished, and there's such a wide range of approaches and styles and, you know, a huge burst of high quality YA fantasy. It will be interesting to go back and look at Aragon and how I feel it holds up compared to some of the things that I have read in the, you know, 15 or however many years it's been since this book was released. Next on my list is Swords Point by Ellen Kushner. Yes, this is described as a comedy of manners. It has a blurb by George R.R. Martin on the front, so if you don't want to take my advice that it's a good book, then you could at least take his. It is fantasy only because it is set in a fantastical land. It does not take place on Earth. It takes place in a fantasy land, but it's more of a kind of court politics. I would kind of compare it to like a Jane Austen, like a witty social commentary, including sword fights and set in a fantasy land. The writing, from what I remember, was really crisp and elegant. When I read this, I think I was like a late teenager when I picked this up, and I remember feeling like it was a totally different style than anything else I had read up to that point. And I remember really enjoying it. There was a lot of political maneuvering. The main character is a swordsman for hire. And he kind of weaves in between the lives of all these petty nobles who are just basically trying to ruin each other and are out for revenge. I don't remember a ton of the actual details, but I remember really liking the characters, really liking the writing, and enjoying the story overall. There are 2 other books in this, 2 companion novels that don't follow the exact same characters but take place in the same world. So I'm hopeful that if I can reread this, then I can go on and finish out the other 2 books that she had written. I don't have the book for the next story I wanted to talk about either, but that would be the Dragonlance series. So Dragonlance, as I'm sure for many, fantasy lovers who were born in the 80s, Dragonlance was one of my early introductions to fantasy. And it is like the most glorious, tropey romp of an adventure that you could ever think of. And I loved it when it came out. Not when it came out, obviously, when I read it. When I first picked it up, I loved it. I so enjoyed reading it. I liked the band of characters. I've heard a couple of people, including Alan at the Library of Alexandria, talk about how he hates Raistlin, one of the main characters who's one of the magic users. I remember really liking his character, so if for no other reason, I would like to go back and see, what kind of taste did I have as a 13-year-old girl? Did that influence the characters that I liked in this story? Am I going to find some of them a lot more annoying than I did back then? Who knows? Not me. That's why I'm going back to reread it, and I'm really excited to go back and see what it's like and if I still enjoy it. I think I'm not expecting this to be high literature, but I think it's going to take a lot to turn my opinion on Dragonlance because it was such a big part of my early fantasy experience, and I feel like it's a milestone. Reading Dragonlance is an event in the life of a young fantasy nerd, so I don't think I'll have too many bad things to say, but it'll be funny to go back and reread, I think. The next book I want to talk about is actually a trilogy, and that is the Dark Elf Trilogy by R.A. Salvatore. This follows one of Salvatore's most famous characters, Drizzt Do'Urden, who is a drow or a dark elf, and it chronicles his, I guess you could call it his coming of age, even though it is an adult fantasy, but it follows him as he leaves his kind of oppressive matriarchal society and makes his way in the outside world, and then just follows him on his adventures as he gathers friends. He becomes acquainted with other ways of thinking and other people. And again, this is kind of a classic first fantasy to get into. It definitely wasn't the first fantasy that I ever read. I was actually a little bit older when I read this. I think I was around 16 maybe. It was definitely in my high school years when I picked this up, but I loved it. I flew through it, and I never really went beyond that in the Forgotten Realms, which is interesting because when I met my husband, we met early in university, and he also read these, so he read my copy and then went on to buy a ton of books in that universe, because that's the type of fantasy that he really likes. He loves R.A. Salvatore. He's definitely one of his favorite authors. And I never really went on and read them. And I don't know if that's just because I wasn't reading fantasy at the time or if I felt like I didn't want any more of that universe. But I am going to reread the Dark Elf Trilogy. And from there, I think at least I would like to read the Icewind Dale Trilogy. So if anybody has any recommendations for must-read series in that universe, must-read books in that universe, I would like to know. I'm always open to reading more of them, but I am looking forward to getting at least back into the Dark Elf Trilogy and seeing how I feel about those now. The 9th book I want to talk about is actually science fiction. So this is Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood. And Margaret Atwood is one of my favorite authors. I read a lot of Margaret Atwood in university and really came to enjoy her style. I saw her speak at a writer's workshop once, and it was a really great experience. She's a very smart lady. She's got a lot of great ideas. Oryx and Crake was one of the earlier books that I read by her, and it really had an impact on me at the time when I read it. I read it back in the early, probably mid-2000s, at a time when dystopian fiction, I feel like the market, or at least what I had been reading, wasn't quite as inundated with dystopian stories. This follows, it kind of has your classic dystopian setup. It follows a group of friends as the world is starting to fall apart. So bioengineering has become really big. There's climate crises, people are being awful to each other. there's no kind of faction system like you see in a lot of YA fantasies. It's more of a reflection on what could happen to the world if the things that we are presently doing continue unchecked at a rate that, you know, harm the environment, that we don't try to take any control over. And it follows this through the lens of 3 friends, and it follows their stories through to, you know, what could possibly be the end of the world. And I remember really, really enjoying it. I like Margaret Atwood's writing style, which I appreciate is not for everyone. But if you are a fan of hers and you haven't ever read this book, or if you like a good science, like a literary science fiction, then I do definitely recommend this. But I would also like to go back and reread it just to see, because I have read so much, you know, I have so many other books in this genre since, and I would like to know, like, do I still have the really strong feelings that I had when I read this 15 years ago? Or have, you know, if I reread it again, will I find it to just be okay? I'm not sure, but I want to know. And finally, I have picked this book because I would love to read it with my kids this year. So this is The Hobbit. I bought this beautiful edition when I finished my residency. It was a present to me from me, and I really love it. These are gorgeous editions, and the Lord of the Rings books that go along with them along with it are really nice as well. But my kids are 5 and 6, and in between that age, like when I was 5 going into 6, is when my dad read me The Hobbit for the first time. And that was, without a doubt, my very first introduction into fantasy, and was the thing that kind of propelled me into this lifelong love of fantasy. I remember everything about reading The Hobbit for the first time. I remember how I felt at each chapter. I remember how I felt when it was over, and it was a huge experience for me. I'm trying to temper my expectations because, you know, I don't want to go in there expecting my kids to feel the same way about it that I felt about it, because I feel like that's a lot of pressure, and I don't want to be disappointed in their reaction, because they're allowed to like what they like, and it doesn't have to be the same things that I like. But I am so looking forward to revisiting this one just to share it with them. And if they love it, then I will be so happy. And if they don't like it, then I'll be happy that I got to read it. And those are all of them. Those are 10 of kind of these nostalgic loves that I would like to go back and examine through my own nostalgia goggles and see, you know, are these books really as great as I thought they were when I read them? Is it because of, you know, the stage of my life that I was in, because of the age that I was, because they influenced so many of the other books that I went on to love afterwards? I'm not sure, but I am mostly excited, a little bit apprehensive with some of them, but mostly excited to go back and read and see how I feel about them. I would imagine that at least some of these books had to have been the early influences for a lot of other fantasy readers out there. So if you also have some nostalgic love for some of these ones, then let me know. If not, let me know what some of your most nostalgic reads are, the books that got you into reading or into fantasy in particular. I would love to know, and I would love to chat about it. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you with another video soon. Bye.